So you've been playing Magic the Gathering for a while, and you've probably heard of what an archetype is. But do you know what a micro-archetype is? I qualified for an RC, which is something I had never done before. So I realized that my next big tournament presents the opportunity to level up. So I thought, how do I do that? I have to hit the book. So today I'm going to talk to you guys about micro-archetypes. So first, macro archetypes. These are the words that you probably always hear. You have aggro, control, combo, and midrange. Now, micro archetypes are historical decks that fall somewhere in between these macro archetypes, because you see, it's not a rigid column list. This is aggro, this is control, this is combo, this is midrange. Rather, think of decks in Magic the Gathering on a sliding scale, where there might be elements of different major archetypes in a single deck. So by studying the history of micro archetypes, you can have a better understanding for what is supported in the game. While the cards may be different than they were in their historical counterparts, understanding how the style of cards included in different decks impact the archetype helps you get a better understanding to get a foot ahead in deck creation in any constructed format. And that's because each of these major archetypes have an underlying theme, a metaphysical motif that is consistent and will stay consistent throughout its existence in Magic. Also, by understanding the major archetypes and the sliding scale of micro archetypes underneath them, you have a better understanding of what is supported and what isn't supported, what are the strengths and weaknesses of each deck type, which may help you, like I'm hoping it helps me, level up. Today we're going to talk about red aggro. Now, when I first heard of red aggro, and probably you too, you think red deck wins, right? Not quite. Before we dive into that deck, let's first revisit one of the most important texts in Magic the Gathering theory and strategy, Who is the Beatdown by Michael J. Flores. In Who's the Beatdown, Mike Flores discussed the importance in a matchup of a player to be able to identify his role as either the aggressive deck, the beatdown, or the control deck, or the permissive, in any given game. Now, that role may change in the middle of a game, but that role identification nonetheless is the most important thing a player can do in order to secure more consistent wins. To do this, he understood a few key factors in order to determine your role. So the first is damage potential. The second is removal capacity. And the third is permission and card drawing. Okay, the deck with the most damage capability typically needs to play the beatdown from the start. So right here, we're going to put a B for beatdown. The deck with the more removal capacity should probably play the control, C for control. And then, of course, the most counter spells and card drawing spells, you should play at least at the beginning of the game, the control. While that might seem obvious to us now, it wasn't always. So having this clear, almost definition of a role in a game of Magic the Gathering is a crucial development or crucial step for a player. And this is a very cut and dry, very easy way to analyze the game. Now, remember, the beatdown and the control doesn't necessarily refer to the archetype of the deck that player is playing. You could be a Azorius control player, but now you have, say, a Hall of the Storm Giants and a Teferi in play, and it's turn 7. Guess what? It's your time to start to win the game. You are the beatdown. Here are 4 key aspects to the beatdown control comparison to help communicate the point. So the first aspect is the primary objective. The primary objective of the beatdown is to deal damage quickly and to reduce an opponent's life total to 0. The control player's primary objective is prevent the opponent's threats and gain card advantage over time. The second primary aspect is deck composition. A beatdown deck will typically have more low-cost, high-efficiency creatures and direct damage spells. The deck playing the control from the beginning will typically be composed of removal, card advantage, and counter spells. The third aspect of the beatdown control comparison is tempo. The beatdown will attempt to establish a fast and aggressive tempo, while the control player will aim to slow the pace of the game and make it to the later stages where they can deploy their own threats. The last aspect that I want to touch on today are the key characteristics. Again, the key characteristic of a beatdown deck from the start of a game is high damage potential and low cost aggressive creatures. The key characteristic of the control deck, again, is high removal capacity and high resource denial capability. Again, that's counter spells and that's card advantage. Now that we have that out of the way, let's talk about our first deck in the 16 MicroArchetype series, Red Aggro. Now, Red Aggro decks have 3 primary characteristics, and they might not have been what you expected. Or maybe they were. Let me know in the comments. Red Aggro has a primary or secondary focus on creature-based attacks. That's your 1 mana, 2 mana creatures. In today's formats, think Monastery Swiftspear. They have a low average CMC or converted mana cost. Again, that's that 1 mana, 2 mana, highly efficient creatures. And they default to the role of the beatdown. Why do you think that is? They default to the beatdown because they need to finish the game before it gets to the late stage. Because those 1 mana, 2 mana efficient creatures, well, they don't quite play out. To better understand this MicroArchetype, we're gonna examine 2 historical examples of the deck. So the first example of a red aggro deck we're gonna look at is Sligh. The second is Deadguy red. But Navigator, when are you going to just start talking about red cards? You know, I asked myself that question too. So let's take a look at the shared principles between these 2 historical decks before we dive into each one individually. And then let's talk about why we call red aggro. So here are 3 shared principles about the Sligh and Deadguy red aggro decks. So the first is they have a low mana curve to seize the initiative. The second thing is they finish the game via reach spells. You mean reach like the keyword ability? No, I mean reach as in spells like Shrapnel Blast. It can deal damage directly to the opponent in a large enough quantity to end the game. And lastly, they have a need to use their burn spells on blockers. Again, you got to think these 1-2 mana creatures aren't just not going to cut it once you have big 4/4, 4/5s, 5/7 beaters on the board, which makes for some tough decisions in this deck. Now, typically, red aggro or the aggro macro archetype is one of the key archetypes that we suggest to newer players. It's an easy way to get into the game. It's easy as in the deck is straightforward, but it could actually be one of the most challenging archetypes to pilot well because of this last thing. Having these burn spells available doesn't mean you should always go directly to face. It also doesn't mean you should always go to your opponent's creatures. So that means In each matchup, when you're playing a red aggro deck, you're faced with dozens and dozens of micro decisions that ultimately decide each game. So to pilot one at a high level is extremely difficult. Okay, I've alluded to it a few times. Why the heck do we call this red aggro if it's not for the red color of Magic the Gathering? So Patrick Chapin writes in his book Next Level Deckbuilding, a red aggro deck has the ability to end the game from outside the red zone, not the color. However, this means that the cards are generally weaker. So let's dive into our first historical example of red aggro, Sligh. Real quick, guys, if you are getting any value from this video whatsoever, the best thing I could ask of you is to like, comment, share, and subscribe to our channel. This is us documenting our journey because we are where you are. And if you like to see any specific content, if you're struggling with an area of Magic, or maybe you want to see me do a certain archetype next, let me know in the comments. Thanks. So this first deck, Sligh, was actually named after a guy named Paul Sligh. Now, Paul wasn't the designer of this deck. However, he did have the first major tournament finish with it, taking it to the finals of a PTQ. This deck is important because it developed the concept of the mana curve, where this deck shined the most because it had turn 1 plays that can turn into turn 2 attacks. So immediately on turn 2, this deck would threaten from inside the red zone. Now, that may seem obvious now. I can promise you it wasn't in 1994 when the average deck didn't do anything until turn 4. The Sligh deck also introduced the concept of recurring card advantage via utility creatures, like this one and this one. This forced the inefficient use of removal spells by opponents. It was inefficient because an opponent was maybe using a 2 or 3 mana removal spell on a 1 mana creature. But because these creatures were a red zone threat, they had to be dealt with. The next seminal historic deck that we're going to look at with the red aggro archetype is Deadguy Red. You see, the golden era of these 1 and 2 drop creatures winning games started to pass. And instead came a time where we needed to actually consider playing around the damage-based removal that started becoming more eminent in the format. So Deadguy Red came about, and it was made famous by David Price and PTLA in 1998. It featured 20 lands, which introduced another kind of card advantage, thinking if they went down from 24-25 to 20 lands, that means another 4 or 5 spells in your deck, which means you're going to be drawing more spells on average than your opponent will be. And then came this innovation where what if I played instant speed buffs on my creatures to get around damage-based removal and blockers, combat tricks as we now call them. So let's do a quick wrap up with the strengths and weaknesses of red aggro as we saw through the Sligh and Deadguy Red decks. So let's start with the strengths. Red aggro clearly gets fast starts. It runs at an aggressive tempo, and it's able to end the game at instant speed with its reach ability. And now for some weaknesses. It has a weak late game potential. It's susceptible to cheap creature focus removal, and it has many decisions that you have to make inside of each game, which greatly increases the difficulty of piloting. Again, these decks are so hard to do at a high level. Thanks so much for watching this video, guys. That was the red aggro MicroArchetype of Magic the Gathering. We'll see you next time with another MicroArchetype. And again, don't forget to comment if you want me to cover an archetype in particular. Please like, share with your friends, and of course subscribe. We'll see you next time. And again, always choose violence.